Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Dan, and this is Forlorn Hobbies. Hello and welcome back to the channel. Now, today's video is a little bit different. We're going to be reflecting upon the recent trip that myself and Tim from Napoleonic Wargaming took to the battlefield of Waterloo in Belgium. Now, I thought I'd approach this from a more of a kind of travel perspective, as Tim has done videos on his channel that focus on the more in-depth historical perspective, and I thought it would be a little bit silly for us to both do the same kind of video. So this video is going to be more about my experiences as someone traveling there, like the kind of things that we can do, and just generally offer my thoughts and give a perspective on that. Now, for the eagle-eyed among you that are looking at the images that are going on in the background and wondering why there are pictures of Playmobil and Lego, well, that will be explained, but I can assure you it is entirely relevant to the trip. Another caveat before I get started really is that I am trying out some new software and PC, so if there are any kind of issues that you pick up on, please do let me know in the comments. Now, the whole concept for this trip started quite a few months ago, back in February, when I had just been away enjoying a lovely weekend away with my wife in York, kid-free, and really fun and exciting time. And then we got back to the absolute chaos that is our children, and got a message from Tim going, "Oh, I'm thinking of going to Waterloo for the anniversary of the battle." And me, being such a good friend, thought, "Oh, I can use this as an opportunity to have something to look forward to escape the hellhole." And thought, "Oh, I'll be a good friend and offer to drive Tim to Waterloo to try and save money on transport." So immediately offered my services. And after a bit of research, we found out that it was actually cheaper to get the Eurostar, and the hotel right on the battlefield. The transport links were excellent as well, so the journey was all planned out for a couple of days. So, living kind of on the Nottinghamshire-Yorkshire border, the train route down to London was straightforward, easy access to the Eurostar. There was very minimal hassle, actually. I would thoroughly recommend travelling on the Eurostar to Waterloo if you want a quick and hassle-free journey. There was a quick change at Brussels to like the overground line, and compared to British transport, it was cheap and efficient, and very kind of reliable from my experience. And it put us straight into Waterloo after about 25 minutes. So it was very easy to navigate. Now, once we'd got to Waterloo, we'd kind of got there about 5 o'clock. We thought we'd have a quick look around the town, because the town itself is where Wellington had his headquarters. So we thought we would just have a little wander up to that and see if it was open, which it was. And there was an incredibly helpful staff member there that gave us lots of information uh, and suggested things in the kind of wider area, from early antiquity stuff to World War II battle and World War One battlefields and that kind of thing within the area, within easy travel distance. So if you were going on a longer trip, then hopefully the very kind lady is still working there, and you can pick her brains, because it was really refreshing to see someone that was clearly passionate about what they do, and you know was in it for that kind of enjoyment rather than just making money to pay the bills. Or at least that was my perception of her. Now, the headquarters themselves was kind of dedicated to telling Wellington's kind of preparations, and you had the exhibitions of his aide-de-camp's bedroom where he spent the night and then died the night after the battle. I think it was Alexander Graham or something like that. Tim would have covered it in his video. And just wandering around, it had been very well kept and laid out. It was very informative. Obviously, it was like a museum, so you'd have artifacts from the battlefield, helmets, cuirasses, weapons, you name it. And it then had a dedicated kind of room for each of like the kind of main players. So you would have obviously your bits dedicated to Wellington. After all, it was his headquarters, but you also had a section dedicated to Blucher and the Prussians, to the Prince of Orange and the Dutch Belgians. So it really gave you a good perspective of the coalition that came together to fight Napoleon, as opposed to the British and the Redcoats. It actually kind of portrayed the Anglo-German Dutch allied force throughout, and it made it clear that there were different elements that made up the army. Obviously, there was a room for Napoleon as well, but it also touched on people like the Earl of Uxbridge, later Marquis of Anglesey, even had a very worn prosthetic from his legs that obviously was lost in the battle. I think his leg is actually buried in the churchyard of the local church as well. So that was something that we didn't get time to see, but if you're sticking around, that's something that you can go on a little adventure to try and find. Now, once we'd kind of done that, we did have to hurry because we only had about an hour before closing, and this is where the first point of interest of the Playmobil comes into play. In their exhibition kind of gallery, there's like a little separate kind of barn building that was attached to it. They had a Playmobil Through the Ages exhibition. Now, obviously, me and Tim, being the massive, oversized kids that we are, made a mental note that we must come back to view that exhibition, because obviously, who doesn't love reliving their childhood and Playmobil and stuff like that. And so I will return to that later in the video, because we obviously made time on our trip back to Brussels to fit that in. So from the Waterloo headquarters of Wellington, the bus stop for getting to the battlefield itself is literally right outside. However, there were some roadworks going on, so it was moved just round the corner, and we had the help of a lovely old Belgian lady that didn't speak much English, but obviously saw that we were very confused why the bus wasn't turning up while standing at the bus stop that was actually out of service. So, she kind of shepherded us along to the correct place, and we got on the bus with no hassle whatsoever, and it was a quick trip to the Route de Lyon, which is the main kind of road from Waterloo to uh, Quatre, and we got off the bus. Well, I was almost thrown off the bus because I was standing in the aisle, and they have a kind of midpoint exit with some steps, and luckily the doors were still shut we when the bus pulled up. Otherwise, I would have probably been on the road. Now, the hotel itself, the 1815 hotel, was perfectly positioned right on the battlefield. It was more than suitable for our needs. It had a very good restaurant that did wonderful food, and there was also an Italian next door to it as well that was superb. So obviously we had to sample that as well. Now, the hotel rooms was a personal highlight of mine, were all named after the various generals at the battlefield. Now, obviously, we weren't um, prized enough to be given Wellington or Napoleon. I, however, was given the Prince of Orange room, so obviously I didn't know whether that was a bit of an insult because I was too British and they wanted to put me under Silly Billy and go, oh, sharp, But I think they missed a trick, and they were obviously not fans of Tim's channel, because if they were, they would have recognised his name and put him in his all-time favourite room, which would have been Grouchy's room, because we all know that Tim loves Grouchy. Now, obviously, we'd settled in, cleaned off all like the hard dust of travel, and had a few beers. I think Tim fell asleep because I was just sat there by my lonesome. And when Tim eventually emerged, we thought, what better to do than to take a nighttime wander along the battlefield? Because the battlefield itself is obviously free to explore. So it's got good paths that you can use, and you only pay to go in the museum kind of and exhibitions themselves and Hugamon, obviously, but you can walk round it. Now, whilst the day was really hot with travelling, the temperature dropped to a point where it was nice and cool, and we just thought we'd have a nice walk round Hugamon, like the exterior of it. Obviously, we couldn't go in it because it wasn't open, and just get a sense of like the locations for what we wanted to do the next day, with like exploring, filming, that kind of thing. And so obviously I'd been to Waterloo quite recently before. I think I went um, kind of midway through COVID with my children. Um, had a very memorable experience of my daughter going, I want to go on the carriage ride, Daddy, down to Hugamont, and having to basically jog behind the horse and carriage because there was not enough room for me to go on it with the rest of my family. So yeah, it was kind of not necessarily traumatic, but yeah, it was nice to just walk carefree down with Tim, just enjoying the kind of peaceful atmosphere when there wasn't really anyone around. Now, that's not to say it's not without its hazards, because we'd walked down, we'd followed the path, walked round Hougoumont, and this is where it kind of started to go a little bit off plan. Now, Tim, in his infinite wisdom, was like, as you look back from Hougoumont, he's like, well, we want to be over there, so why are we walking back that way with the path? It's clearly going to be quicker to cut across the wheat fields. I don't know if he was being possessed by Theresa May and her childhood misdemeanors, but he went full Theresa. That's the only way I can describe it. Wading through all the wheat like he was in the fields of Elysium, and as a concerned friend, obviously I followed him to make sure that he was all right. Now, at this point, the sun was very much setting, so it was not very well lit, and the wheat fields became cabbage fields. And the cabbage fields were probably the reason why Ridley Scott thought that there were these elaborate trench systems at Waterloo in his Napoleon biopic film. Because I was looking straight ahead, following Tim. I could see his silhouette in the darkness, and then I could not, because obviously the cabbages had decided that the fight back against veganism and vegetarianism starts now, and they had mistook Tim for the champion of that cause, and they wanted to assert their dominance in the food chain. Now, luckily, Tim was not injured in his misfortune against the cabbages, but we've all heard of the famous Emu Wars and thought how ridiculous it was, but we have a very own first Cabbage War, and unfortunately, Napoleonic Wargaming lost. Obviously, he rolled a double six and blundered, because that is just his nature, and it was probably the quickest surrender I've seen since the French in 1939. But we eventually made it back safe and sound to our hotel room to explore and refresh for the day that's coming up. So on our first full day at the battlefield, we were up bright and early for opening, and it was the anniversary of the battle itself, the 18th of June, and we were kind of expecting it to be very busy, because obviously it's the anniversary. But the main anniversary event was actually planned for a few weeks later, and we could see all the seating being kind of prepared for that. So it was a shame that we didn't kind of see that in all its glory, but it actually gave us a much more personal kind of experience of the battlefield. Now, when we got there, there was a couple of people around, and we'd gone into the main museum. Now, as you go down into the entrance, they have the orders of battle of the armies that took part engraved on the stone walls kind of that allow the dip down, because the new museum is sunk into the ground so it doesn't blemish the kind of landscape. And this was Tim's first time of actually kind of experiencing this, because he'd been to Waterloo, I think, for the 100th anniversary, and it was not quite ready. So it was nice to take a bit of time and refresh my mind whilst he took in the experiences, and obviously did his YouTube things and his recordings. Now, I've not quite got to the stage where I can just bust out my phone and start recording myself talking at a camera and have all these kind of strange people look at you and go, what is that person doing? And, have those awkward conversations. So I just kind of let him get on with it and pretended to be engrossed in other things when people came up and questioned him. But he didn't really get that many kind of people approach him. So that was something. Now, in the lobby, they have a fantastic diorama of the Waterloo battlefield. And I think it's in 1/72nd, maybe 20mm scale. And it is phenomenal to just look at it and see all the detail and effort put into it. Now, I had thought that this would have been specifically made for the museum, but no, there's a placard, and I was actually reading it this time, that said that it was made over 30 years by a husband and wife. Now, I don't know about you, but if I suggested to my wife that we spend 30 years building and painting a diorama of Waterloo in our evenings, and that I would probably be spending those 30 years in the shed. So that man must have won in the game of life, because he found a partner that not only allowed and put up with his hobbies like all of our partners do, but actively engaged in it, and probably in a very time consuming, that was pretty much all their spare time for that time as well. Now, there are pictures of it on here, but seeing it in person is the only way that it can do it justice. You just need to pick out all the different details, like the deployments, where, for example, you've got the Nassau regiments down by Papilot, and the Brunswickers, the squares, all that. The attention to detail is great. There's also separate dioramas of the Prussians on the march, which are kind of around the main diorama, and that's just in the entrance lobby. Now, we didn't linger there for too long because we wanted to, as I said, we thought it was going to get busy. So we went and saw the kind of the big kind of painting thing. I've forgotten what it is called, where you've got the charge of Ney leading the cavalry against the squares. And we had this pretty much to ourselves. We just wandered around, taking all the time, picking out specific details in the pictures. Like, you had someone defending the cannons, you had the horses being, you know, it again, like, words cannot describe just how much detail that you take in when you're looking at it. And as I say, Tim's done a video on this, so go and see that for his, more of a perspective. But even if you have no interest in history and you're just dragged like you're like a spouse that's been dragged along, they will appreciate the detail and understanding that has gone into that work of art. It is stunning. And from there, we went up the Lion's Mound. Now, we're not the fittest of people, so we did stop halfway just to have a little breather. And we thought we'd do it early morning before the sun had a chance to bake us alive. And again, it was just us up there. We had plenty of time to just sit down, wander around up the top, and have a real kind of bird eye perspective of the battlefield. Now, obviously, the Lion's Mound was not there at the time of the battle. It was built as a monument to the Prince of Orange and his heroic actions, although some recollections may vary, I think is the phrase that the monarchy used to dispute certain information. Um, and although I am surprised that, given Ridley Scott's creative licenses, he didn't decide to put the British batteries on the top of the Lion's Mound thinking that it was there at the time, although that would have made quite amusing cinema. But I digress. Now, when you're atop the mound, you get a real perspective of just how wide the battlefield is, but also how narrow it is. Because you can see Hougoumont at one end, and you can see down towards Papelotte, although Papelotte itself is hidden. You can see Plassenoir in the trees at the back, behind La Belle Alliance. And, you know, as you pan this kind of farmland, it's peaceful. And that's often the case with going to battlefields. You get that kind of peaceful aura that gives you a kind of somber feeling upon reflection of, was this field really the place where thousands of people died and the ground is literally been fertilized by their blood and that kind of thing. And it just, makes you think about how could this peaceful place really have had all that smoke, gunfire, cannon sound, really disturbing the equilibrium of the place. And I always like to just take a moment to just sit and reflect and try and visualize this kind of atmosphere change. Uh, but yeah, now I should say that the battlefield is split into two parts at this point. You obviously have the Charleroi Road, basically cutting it in half at La Haye-Sainte. And our first day we decided to spend exploring the kind of main British side, so the side between the Charleroi Road and Hougoumont, which is where the museum is based and situated. It's also the most altered part of the battlefield because it's where the sunken defences and the ridge that was kind of scraped up to form that monstrosity, as Wellington thought of it, that is the Lion's Mound. So it gives you a kind of false perspective of looking at the battlefield, thinking, oh, it doesn't really seem like you can hide infantry here, or it would really impede cavalry much in that way. But on the other side of the road is very much the kind of landscape that you would have had on the battlefield because it's more untouched. Anyway, we'd been up the top of the Lion's Mound, we'd come down, had a little sit down and rest after descending because, we're very unhealthy. And as the sun reached its height, we thought, oh yes, this will be a great time to wander down the road to Hougoumont. Now, along the way, there are, and this is the same for across the battlefield really, is that the monuments to specific actions, regiments, even generals, captains, commanders, that kind of thing, just pop up out of nowhere. So you had like Mercer's battery point is marked on the spot, for example, and they just litter the road all over the place. And you're finding these little plaques here and there to commemorate specific heroic actions of note. And obviously, we stopped at each and every one of them for a bit of vlogging from Tim, and then we explored Hougoumont. Now, Hougoumont itself has obviously been largely left as it was after the remains of it was restored after the battle. The main chateau building is no longer there. All that's left is the chapel, which has a fascinating story in itself. But I think when you hear about the significance of Hougoumont in the battle, you expect this massive kind of bulwark and almost fortress-like kind of thing with the significance that Wellington put on it. But it's actually very small. I think Tim remarked that he was surprised at just how small Hougoumont is for the amount of manpower that was devoted to it throughout the battle. And, you know, unfortunately, we missed the time of the show in Hougoumont because we don't really know French. We decided not to go to the French sitting of it. But we just had a wander around looking at the memorials to the Guard, to the French regiments that were there, the generals and the like, and just kind of trying to imagine the absolute chaos that would have been taking place in that area of the battlefield. And you also note quite just how it was so easy for Napoleon to commit so much of his forces to this, because from where his command point was, you couldn't actually see Hougoumont, and that's even with all the woods being cut down, and that it would have only made it worse at the time. So he didn't really know what was going on in that part of the battlefield, but I will talk more about that when I get to day 2, because that was when we went to his side of the field. Now, at Hougoumont, you've got the remains of the chapel, and in it has a crucifix with burnt feet. Now, the legend is that once the main chateau was set on fire, the house burned down until it reached this crucifix, and it was almost like a divine intervention that only the feet of Christ were burnt, and then the flames stopped. Now, I don't know the depth of the historical accuracy of it, but there is a very detailed plaque next to it, kind of giving you the story of the crucifix, because it's quite a miraculous thing to experience. So if you ever find yourself at Waterloo, I would very much recommend checking that out. Now, for the rest of the day, because we'd obviously gone during a heat wave kind of thing, we decided to get all the kind of vigorous stuff out of the way first of all, where we'd be in the sun, and then we spent the afternoon in the museum, and that was nice and cool. Now, the museum is fascinating. It's quite a modern museum, and it tells the story of revolutionary France all the way through to Napoleon's surrender and exile at St. Helena. Now, I cannot state how much this is a hobbyist's dream of the layout of this, or part of this exhibition that they have, because there is a kind of gallery that you walk up, which is full of examples of uniforms that were worn by the forces involved in the 100 Days campaign. And for all those button counters and lacing enthusiasts out there, that complain on all the Facebook groups, oh, it must have this button or this type of thread and all that kind of, which you do you, that's fine. You will literally be in dreamland in this part of the exhibition. And yeah, it's some of it is obviously recreated and replicas, but there are actual kind of weaponry, helmets, and stuff that they have found on the battlefield there as well. A lot of cuirasses with shot holes blown through them comes to mind. And there's also a very interesting 3D film or short film that they have with a very sad little drummer boy that's just, sat there just still drumming, surrounded by the dead at the end afterwards. And it just gives you that kind of like harrowing engagement with the events of the day, and which is obviously in stark contrast to the peace and tranquility that you have looking across the farm fields and the cabbages. I mean, I think Tim was slightly haunted by this point, but again, it just offers you that kind of more in-depth engagement. Once we had finished with the main museum, the kind of guest display that is on show in their kind of secondary exhibition point at the moment is Napoleon's life in Lego, which is obviously why Lego was mentioned at the start of the video. Now, this exhibition particularly made my 10-year-old very jealous that he was not coming, and I was incredibly impressed with the amount of detail that could be put in Lego. There were obviously a variety of displays, right from Napoleon's birth at Corsica, of various kind of sizes, picturing like his coronation, the sands of Egypt, all the way through to Waterloo, and there's a little Hougoumont thing, and every piece kind of that was kind of like a diorama of Lego had little gems in it, whether it was the mummies in Egypt, or the fact that to make the squares kneeling down, they just took a leg off and put it in front of each soldier. The carrot wielder in the Hugomont stable, just having fun feeding the horses, with oblivious to going outside with that classic Lego happy man expression on his face. And there was also kind of Lego portraits, and these were stunning. And the detail on some of them was so good that my camera thought that it was an actual face. Now, I think the exhibition is there until next year, so I would thoroughly recommend sorting it out, especially if you've got children that are Lego obsessed. This could be a great way to kind of start that indoctrination into historical enthusiasm that the younger generation needs, in my opinion. And that was pretty much it for the day. The evening was spent having refreshments at the hotel, sitting out in the lovely sun, watching party after party go up in this bizarre fine dining experience. We both looked at it and went, I'd rather keep my feet on the ground. And we have had some good chats with some of the other visitors to the battlefield. Tim was recognised by a couple of his subscribers, and we had really good and engaging conversations with them. And it's nice to see that, especially the work that Tim puts into his channel, is kind of acknowledged and appreciated um, by the viewers that he puts out. And it's always rewarding to kind of see that kind of engagement face to face, whether it's a convention or even bizarrely in the middle of Belgium. Um, and yeah, no, I'd really like to bump into those people again. I'm dreadful with names, so at the time of recording, I have unfortunately forgotten. But yeah, it was great to just kind of added that extra appreciation to an already great trip. And day two, we kind of went into the wild. This time we explored down. Our aim was to go down to Papalot and then walk up, kind of taking the route to Plassinois to see where the kind of Prussians approached from. Now we started off at the Picton's Memorial, um, and headed off down the dirt track to what we thought was Papalot that we could see in the distance, but it turned out that it was a music school, and Papalot was in fact the distance again in that direction. So the first thing we noticed was that it was a lot more up and down. There was a lot of times where you couldn't actually see across the battlefield. You were hidden, and it just gave you a much better appreciation of, oh, as wargamers, we look at Waterloo as like a kind of flat battlefield map, but in reality, it's lots of dips and ducks and hidden spaces, and it kind of really throws into like kind of appreciation for like the need to have that kind of terrain element. Now, obviously, where the ground battery was positioned, it could fire across all these. It would have seen and been able to identify targets. But you're looking at the cavalry charges. You look at the wet weather; they would be going up and down through all these things. The horses would be worn out at certain points. Um, they wouldn't be able to see hidden dips until they were right on top of them in that. So you can really kind of start to envisage the chaos that must have occurred on that day. Now, I think out of the three kind of main farm kind of settlements that you kind of think about when you look at Waterloo, you would be mistaken for thinking Papelot was the biggest, because obviously it's been rebuilt and it is still in use today as a private residence, and I think it's an equestrian centre now. But it was probably the grandest looking. Now it was, but so it was very hard to kind of visualize the less importance of it than Hougoumont, because I mean you can't look past the rebuild, but it was very isolated again at the other end, and just looking at the terrain around it, you could really understand and appreciate like the difficulties that you would have had in directing troops to assault it and also to defend kind of positions like this. And it also gave you a much better understanding of why Hougoumont was so important, because it would have been in a similar kind of position, isolated and out of the way. I think when the Prussians came, this was the kind of direction they would have also have been coming from. And from a gaming perspective, certainly has given me some terrain ideas, because unlike the Hougoumont set, which Tremontium Hobbies needs to hurry up and finish, I think the Papelot set is much more affordable and a much more realistic project to just drop in to a game. And maybe you will see something on it on here in the future. Now, from Papelot, we decided to walk up kind of across the line of the Prussian advance up to Plassenois. Now, I think this part of the journey gave you the best perspective of just how, without modern technology, just how easy it is for people to just get lost in what's going on, because it was so isolated from the battlefield. Although it was part of the battlefield, you had no idea what was going on at Le Haissant in the middle, let alone Hougoumont down the other end, because you couldn't even see it half the time. You were just walking through roads that were surrounded on either side by banks that supposedly cavalry had jumped across, but it just didn't look realistic at all for that. So obviously, you could see why they'd fallen in. You could probably move battalions through these roads and not really be seen because you'd be covered. And yeah, arriving in Plassenois, you could obviously see as you're walking up across the battlefield where it opened up nearer the French positions, and you could just see how vital Plassenois was to the French, because it's not actually that far from Napoleon's headquarters at La Belle Alliance for that day. And you can understand why the guard were dispatched to be thrown into the town to keep it safe, because if the Prussians had it, it was a bad day for the French. And Plassenois itself, again, is a very peaceful little village town. The Prussian monument is absolutely stunning, and the church, which was famous pretty much from the battle, obviously was burnt down. So it's not the church that was there, it's a rebuild. But even so, it sits in a commanding presence in the village. It has the walls around it. You could see why it was kind of the center of the struggle for control of the village during the day. You can see the lovely little kind of farm buildings and little village houses around that possibly have their foundations on the streets of the time. And you can kind of sit there and try and imagine the panic and determination of both of the advancing armies. I think there's a very famous painting of the Prussian advance through Plassimoir, and you just see the dense mass of bodies and the dead just lying around, and the French kind of again just formed up with the young guard trying to throw them out. And again, sitting there on a peaceful day, it's hard to visualize, but it gives you a very good kind of sense of um, why it was such a key place and the struggle that went on to control it. Now, I actually found Plassimoir to be probably the most drawing of the places that we visited, and it led me. I think the first thing I did when I got back to the hotel room that night was to look at the Plassimoir scenario in Albion Triumphant 2, and was really kind of like, yeah, I'm going to do this scenario, because it just had lots of little things that inspired me. And then I looked at how many battalions of Landwehr I needed to paint, and then thought again. But I think between that and just seeing like the Nassau uniforms, they were the two kind of major motivators for me from a hobbyist perspective. And these that's kind of the message that these trips kind of give you. It revitalizes your inspiration. It can lead to very bad financial decisions down the road buying new armies. I've so far resisted buying a Nassau army, but I can assure you it will only be a matter of time before I succumb to that. Now, the one downside I will say about Plassimoir is that I don't know if it's just our bad map reading skills, but we'd kind of got there for lunchtime. There was no cafes or stuff that we could find that were open. We luckily managed to find a kind of corner shop where I could get a croissant and a drink, and Tim, obviously embracing holiday, had an ice cream or ice lolly for his lunch. And then we set off to La Belle Alliance, which, for such a kind of strategic kind of, well, it's not really strategic, but kind of visual place for the battlefield. I mean, it's this scene of where Napoleon kind of observed the battle, and it's where Blucher and Wellington met. I think even the Prussians and the European kind of continent as a whole referred to it as the Battle of La Belle Alliance rather than the more English "we want Waterloo." Um, it just struck me how it's just off the side of the busy road. There is a plaque going, "This is where Napoleon spent his last spent the Battle of Waterloo. It's a private use. I think it's a nightclub now. And I think it's just a real missed opportunity to have done something like they did with the Wellington headquarters. And I know there's a Napoleon headquarters where he spent the time a bit before the battlefield, further on down the road towards Charleroi. But I just think such a pivotal place, from a historical perspective, has so much potential that it's just being wasted upon. And then from there, we decided that we would follow the route pretty much of the Old Guard in their final advance towards the ridge. And as you can see from Tim's second video, it took us quite a while to walk that, because literally every 30 seconds Tim would stop and do an update, which I have no problems with at all. It was nice to pace out our journey. But even on that route, it gives you a kind of an understanding of the layout of the battlefield, the threats around you, what you can see, what you can't see. And it was all in all a very informative and inspirational kind of experience to get both perspectives. You could just go to the museum and focus solely on the Anglo perspective. But if you take time to move throughout the area, you can get the Prussian perspective, you can get the French perspective, and then it gives you a real rounded kind of understanding of just how each side would have seen things during the battle and that kind of impact that it would have had. Now, we obviously decided to do a little bit more exploring around Hougoumont and that, because we were kind of back in that direction. And then we hit up the Italian for some nice pizza, and then a few more drinks, just taking in the sun on our final full day at Waterloo. Now, we're coming to the end of our trip, so we didn't really have enough time to push our experiences further, to go to, say, Ligny or Quatre-Bras or even Wavre, because we were on foot. Now, if we'd have taken a car, we could have kind of expanded our horizons a lot more efficiently. There are bus options, but we didn't really feel like we had enough time to waste travelling to each of those locations when, with the heat and everything, we just thought we'd keep it compact to the immediate battlefield of Waterloo. But I would thoroughly recommend, if you had more time, to allow for visiting those areas as well. So with our Friday morning, we had enough time to just return and revisit the museum, the main exhibition hall, just to kind of take in any last details that we might have overlooked. And then it was time to start our journey back to Brussels. But first of all, we had a very important stop to make. And that was, of course, to go and spend half an hour or so looking at the Playmobil exhibition at Wellington's headquarters. Now, this exhibition was very interesting. It obviously, as a child, you can remember their kind of like historical push for Playmobil ranges with the Romans and the Egyptians and that kind of thing. And it certainly did not disappoint. Now, you had the Lighthouse of Alexandria. You had the Battle of Thermopylae, Actium, and various other kind of classical kind of scenes that were being displayed, like life in Roman towns, what looked like Tettenberg Forest, with the Romans being ambushed by the Germanic tribes. And then obviously you had Napoleon's life in a little bit less detail than the Lego exhibition, in Playmobil. Now, again, you had him in Egypt, and they even had the final kind of living experience of Napoleon on St. Helena, kind of displayed in Playmobil. There wasn't as many battles, although Tim was greatly relieved to see the Playmobil camels be included in the Battle for the Pyramids. So I think it's safe to say it was a trip or a stop worth revisiting just for that kind of experience. Now, I don't think there was a clear winner between Lego and Playmobil in who did the best exhibition, because they both offered different things, but it was good to see so much creativity being used from kind of things to kind of almost like an active drive to make it more interesting to families and young children. Unfortunately, I think both exhibitions are only temporary, although, things like this, it would be great to see kind of more often in various locations, because I'm quite lucky that I've indoctrinated my children since birth to be historically kind of focused, but certainly things like this would have really helped boost their engagement when we go to visit all these kind of historical places that I spend most of my free time doing when I am not suffering at a painting desk. And then again, it was pretty straightforward trip home. Now, I had no issues getting back to my local town. However, Tim was quickly reintroduced to the harsh realities of British public transport, with his train being delayed and held up, I think, around Leicester, because he decided that he would go directly to Sheffield rather than go the route that he took coming down, which was the route that I take. And I think he might have been regretting certain decisions. So that kind of concludes the reflections of the thing, and I just wanted to take a few minutes just to kind of sum up my experiences. Now, would I recommend visiting Waterloo? Yes, absolutely, because it gives you a real perspective, and like a visual kind of perspective to all the books that you read and on it. It helps you visualize, it offers inspiration. From a hobbyist perspective, the projects that needed that bit of motivation to kind of carry on with, or to new ideas, like my brain was just spinning constantly with idea after idea of projects that I could do in relation to this, as if I haven't got enough to do already. Travel wise, it's very accessible, I think. whether you drive, you fly, you get the train, and that. And I also think it's something that you can do by yourself, with a partner, with a friend, or even as a family. And that you just need to cater your expectations and plan accordingly. It's not overly busy most of the time. Again, that's good. It gives you less stress. And I think overall it gives a really satisfying experience that I can't really think of anywhere that offers a kind of battlefield museum that in depth. But at the same time, I think there are also room for improvements. Like you have the anniversary reenactment that we missed, that is a fantastic spectacle by all accounts. But they were advertising reenactment shows that we didn't see because they weren't actually there, because we sat waiting for them. They weren't on. And having seen them before, I feel like that's an area they could probably improve, especially like during the holiday times. Perhaps that would really make it more engaging for families. But that said, I think I've rambled on long enough. I'm hoping to get back to being more regular. I've finally got a new and improved computer, and just said I'm trying out some new editing software, so hopefully it will be less stressful for me to get these videos up and about, and take a little bit less of my time. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If anything, it's just giving you something to have as background noise whilst you churn out a battalion or two, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time, enjoy your hobby.